the webinar that's kindly been organised to discuss how ports across the UK can prepare, support future lower carbon fuels. My name's Geraint Evans, and I'm the Chief Executive of the UK Major Ports Group. We're the leading trade association supporting the larger ports across the UK. But this is a broader conversation about how we can make sure that all ports across the UK are thinking about and discuss how we can best support the transition, discuss the challenges, discuss the opportunities. So, like I said, I'm the Chief Exec of the UK Major Ports Group, and I'm delighted to have the chance to sort of chair this meeting and welcome our esteemed guests. And in no particular order, I will welcome Megan Turner, who's the Environment and Sustainability Manager at the Port of Dover. I'll also introduce Kirsty Gauk, who's the Systems Engineer from the Connected Places Catapult, which is a very interesting organisation, and also Dr. Simon Bullock, who's a Research Associate at the University of Manchester. So good morning all, and thank you for giving up your time on a cold January morning. But as you will all be working on, this is a really big topic for all ports really, and certainly for the ports thinking about how we make sure we're fit for the future and everything else like that. So I hope this will be a broad and open discussion. We will have questions from those joining us, but please, Kirsty, Simon, and Megan, I'm very keen that you sort of offer some interesting views, and perhaps we can open a wide discussion thereafter. So what I would like to do, if it's okay, is go to our first perspective, and that will be from Megan, who, as I said, is the Environment Sustainability Manager on the Port of Dover. And Megan, please do tell us a bit more about yourself before you go into your thoughts.
Hi everyone, as Geraint said, I'm Meg, the Environment Sustainability Manager at the Port of Dover, so that covers all things if it's under that banner, biodiversity, waste, oil. I've worked at the port for 6 or 7 years now, so quite some time, but we're talking more about kind of decarbonisation and future fuels today. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've done in Dover to prepare for future fuels, some of the things we've kind of learned from what we've done so far, and some of the things that we still need to do that, are more challenging, shall we say, than some of the others. So if it's all right, can I have my slides, please, Maxine? Thank you. Yeah, so if you can go to the next slide, please, that would be great. So the first thing, the main thing that I wanted to talk about and what we've done so far is our CMDC project. So it was a feasibility called Green Corridor at Short Straits. That's what that little acronym at the top is there. And we were really looking at what do we need to do to be a green corridor for our kind of Dover, Calais, Dover, Dunkirk, that main kind of passenger ferry route that we're kind of most known for. And we kind of had some quite strong indications going into the project that it was looking like electricity was going to be kind of the future fuel of choice for that route just because of the distance. But as part of that project, we worked with a number of partners, University of Warwick, University of Kent, as well as some energy partners, so Schneider Electric and SSE, and then all our ferry operators. We also worked alongside the ports of Calais and then some smaller businesses in our area, JG Maritime Solutions, and so that's everyone that we work with. We then kind of looked at, we think it's electric. The ferry operators are kind of indicating to us that it's going to be electric, but is that the right choice from a carbon point of view, from a cost point of view, from a technology readiness point of view? So University of Warwick did a lot of work looking at all of those fuels, and electricity did come out as the top choice for our channel. As some of you will know, it's a very intense channel. It's 52 ferry crossings a day, 24/7, but 364 days of the year. So we have 13 different ferries on the route doing those 52 crossings. So it is quite an intense route. And so because of that, we were very aware the kind of energy we were going to be talking about needing in Dover was going to be a bit of a challenge. We were also very aware that, I'm not going to come into work tomorrow and there's going to be 13 fully electric ferries all just sat there waiting to go in one go. It's going to be kind of a staged approach. And that's what you can see here. So after discussion with those ferry operators about who's going to go hybrid first, who wants to go straight to fully electric, on what timescales do you think that might happen? We kind of came out with these 4 scenarios of what that might look like. So you can see there we've got different ferry operators, some going straight to hybrid, some go straight to electric, some going to hybrid. You can see there at different timescales. These have all changed a little bit. I think it's quite still a fluid place in Dover at the minute. We do have some ambitions to bring some of these dates forward even, which is really exciting, but also a little bit of a challenge. You can see there in the numbers quite the kind of like both the mean and the peak electricity that we've been talking about for the types of ferries that we'd have on those different time scenarios. And if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please, Maxine. I think on this slide, you can see a bit better what that looks like. So it's exactly the same scenarios with the same, makeup of vessels, whether it's hybrid, electric, or a mix of both. But here you can see what a standard kind of day demand looks like. So this is kind of an average over the whole year of what's a normal day going to look like. The purple line shows you what the grid could give us on those time horizons, and then obviously the black line is what that ferry load would look like. So I think the thing that stands out here is on every single time horizon there is a bit to make up from what the grid can give us versus to what we actually need to power those ferries. So this kind of left us with a lot of questions. Okay, we know what the ferry fuel of choice is. We know kind of what that power demand is going to look like, but how do we get the power here from the grid? How long is that going to take? And then also, what do we do about the fact that those lines don't line up right now? So there's been lots of discussions about what to do. So do we look at alternative sources of electricity getting here? Do we just use the grid? Do we have solar as well at the port, wind at the port? Do we look at kind of an energy aware berthing schedule? So our current ferry schedule is really just based off of logistics and speed of getting the ferry here, unloading, reloading, getting out as quickly as possible. We've never really looked at it and gone, if that ferry waited 5 minutes before they came, or if that ferry stayed 5 minutes longer and then left, could we actually smooth out some of those peaks? We're pretty sure we can, probably not all of them, but we can make a bit of a difference. So that's kind of the stage that the port is at right now. We're in the middle of a process of looking at how do we get the grid power here? How long will that take? What are we going to do about the shortfall? Is it going to be batteries? All of those things I mentioned earlier, and then looking at how do we do that. So we're also in a bit of an unusual situation as well, that obviously our vessels do just go to Dover and Calais and Dover Dunkirk. They don't go anywhere else. So that physical connection point might be a bit different than some of the ones you see around the rest of the world, partly because we need to transfer this huge amount of power in only about 45 minutes, which is a huge challenge. 30 megawatts in 45 minutes is not something that's easy to do, and it's not something that you see happening in many places right now. So we're very aware that we're quite a unique little area here, and it is quite a special route. So we've been really looking at what do we now do to actually put this feasibility study into practice. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Maxine. Thank you. I thought I'd talk as well about some of the other considerations, because that ferry project work is really great, but it is quite unique. It's not the kind of thing that every port in the UK can kind of relate to, because not every port has that same situation. So some of the other things that we're both working on and challenged by is also, yes, we're mainly known for ferries, but we are also the second busiest cruise terminal in the UK, and we do have a cargo terminal. The future kind of landscape for their fuels is quite different compared to what we're looking at with our ferries. Our ferries are very, sure, it's electric. They're in that process of, we have some hybrids already here and some being ordered. But what does it look like for cruise and cargo? You can see in that picture there, there's all different choices of what the fuel might be. Will it be a mix? What will it look like? And that can be tricky for ports, because we can't all provide everything, but we need to have the right things there for the people that come to our ports. Something as well that not every port will be in the same situation, but we are in Dover, is we don't currently provide any fuel bunkering in Dover. All the vessels that come here actually bunker when they're in France, because it's cheaper to do so and it's easier for them to do so over there. So we don't have any kind of bunkering infrastructure space for that infrastructure at all in Dover. So if we now need to start having infrastructure for other types of fuels, because they need it for filling up more often, where would we do that? We don't have any infrastructure that could be kind of retrofitted to be changed to a different fuel. We'd have to completely start from square one. So that's something to consider, because there is quite a space requirement for that kind of infrastructure. Again, for a port like us, something else that's really important is thinking about vehicles fuel transition. We're not just a port in isolation. We do service thousands and thousands of HGVs a year, and every 3 HGVs is about a megawatt of power. So when you start to add that up over what we get across the year, it's coming pretty close to the kind of 160 megawatt amount that the ferries will need as well. So that's a whole other thing to think about as a port. Do we have to have some sort of accommodation for that in the port, near the port? Can we co-locate some of these things? How can we make that work as a system as well, so that we're not just focusing on the vessels, we are looking at that whole supply chain as one. We also have to think about the port's own transition. It's normally a lot easier for a port to focus on those things, because they're much smaller in scale from an emissions perspective, and we also have 100% of control on those. So in Dover, we have made some quite big moves for our own transition, which has been brilliant, but that does impact the things that we then need to provide for everyone else. You know, we've started electrifying all of our own equipment and all of our own buildings, so we're kind of eating up every little bit of spare grid capacity that we do currently have, which only puts pressure more on the amount that we can get going forward to support our tenants, our stakeholders, helping them decarbonize as well. And something that, again, is not every port, but some ports, is space requirements. If anyone's been to Dover, you know how incredibly space constrained we are. You know, we have the White Cliffs of Dover on one side and the harbour on the other side. There's no area for us to expand. So where we allow this charging for even just HGVs, where would we have a space for stationary HGVs to charge? Where would we have the location for these future fuels, bunkering infrastructure or battery charging? Where will we do all of these things? How will we bring them into such a busy port and into a town, a port that's so close to a town, and still kind of make that work as a whole? So it's definitely some of the things. These are kind of the things that we're thinking on right now, as well as how do we take that step further and not just look at the ferries, but look at everything that comes to and from the port. I think some of the key things that we've learned that have really been beneficial in what the work we've done so far in helping us prepare for this is that early engagement with your stakeholders. Before this CMDC project, we had good engagement with our ferry operators, but it's improved so massively through this project in helping us, you know, all understand each other, that no one can do this alone, and we need to be speaking to our ferry operators about what they do and don't want, and we need to be able to make sure that that can be planned in place for the port to work in years and years in advance, because this isn't the kind of thing that's going to be built overnight. So that's been really beneficial and helped us all. As well, I guess something that's, again, maybe a bit more specific, but most ports will be looking at, is grid connections. The delay in getting a grid connection is incredibly long. So if you think you need more, start looking at that from day one almost. Have an idea of what you need and start engaging, because it is really, really long wait times. And you don't want that to be the reason that you can't make some of these changes. That's one of the things that we've found, is almost that the grid is going to be the deciding factor of when we can do these things, rather than the ambition of the port and the ferry operators, because we'd all move a little bit earlier if we could, but you know, we can only go so far with the fuel being there. So I think, yeah, really working as a group and get engaged in all of these different funding opportunities and opportunities to work with people like universities and the catapults, because they have all this expertise that ports and shipping operators, ferry operators are going to need to use. And so we've found it really beneficial to us to kind of help us solve some of the problems that would have taken the port a lot longer to come to by ourselves. So I can't recommend looking at those opportunities that are out there enough. I think that's everything I was going to touch on, if that's all right, Geraint. Thank you.
Megan, thank you. Really interesting perspectives, and I'm fascinated by, as you quite rightly highlight, the change and the transition is allowing you to have different conversations with your stakeholders. So can you tell us a bit more about that? And I'm also interested in how you think government and agencies and the NESOs and the like can play their part in terms of power and grids and everything else. So I'm really interested in terms of, because as you quite rightly highlight, this is not something that just a port can do. And given your relatively unique circumstances down at Dover, I do think it's a really interesting thing. And then my third point was, what are you, in terms of on the French side, what are you seeing on the French side that's interesting in that corridor, is whether it's a natural or slightly concocted corridor? What are you seeing? So there's a couple of points there, Megan, perhaps you could address.
Yeah, so maybe this is a Port of Dover specific thing, or maybe it's something other ports can relate to, but we'd always been in a situation where an operator would order a vessel and this vessel would be being built, and they'd then tell us, this is what the vessel looks like, this is how it's going to fit in your berth. So you need to change this bit about the berth and knock this bit down here and do this because our vessel won't fit. And I think that's a lot of investment needed from the port then to keep changing our berths for new vessels. But also, it does lead to delays, and we've kind of been able to, with this engagement, been able to go, this isn't the right way of doing this. And if we actually collaborate at the beginning and we work together, we can not have to change every berth every time you want a new vessel. We can help get one that fits right. We can help get one that we're aligned, so that when you arrive, we can have the power there for you. I mean, I think everyone knows we've got two really big double-ended hybrid ferries on the route right now that can't charge at either end. And that's a perfect example of what has happened in the past, where a vessel's been ordered, it's been on its way here before the port's really been told about what they would like from the port. And I think we're not going to make the big enough moves that we need to do to decarbonize the maritime sector without changing that. And this project has helped us do that. It's been really great. Your second point about government. So I think the thing that we're the biggest on is just we need some support on the grid side of things here. We either need, people like, can ports move further up the queue because of the impact that we can have on the entire supply chain? You know, Dover, if you look at the whole system, so not just the ports, but all the ships and the HGVs, it's 8% of UK's maritime emissions is just this ferry route. That's a huge, huge portion that we could wipe out if we had that electricity here. So, you know, should that not move maybe slightly ahead of the queue? Is there not a way to prioritize projects that are going to have such a big national impact? Because right now, you know, we're stuck behind in a really slow queue, not being able to move forward. Also, the cost of those upgrades. Just for context, obviously Calais are in the same position as us. They do have power more easily accessible to them, but they still need an upgrade. And their upgrade is looking in the tens of millions of euros, and ours is in the hundreds of millions of pounds for exactly the same kind of power, plus the fact that they can get theirs in 2 to 3 years, and we're needing to wait 7, 8, 9 years for ours. So I think that kind of shows the really different landscapes we have in the UK versus France, specifically for us, which again is delaying this project as a whole. So that's something that we're really keen to see, is some support on helping these projects move fast through the queue, and some look at the way that we charge for grid upgrades for that kind of end person requesting it. And then Calais, before this project, we didn't really have great engagement with Calais on this topic specifically. I think it's fair to say they felt this was very much a problem for the ferry operators to solve because it was them that wanted this power. But through this project, we've been able to kind of help them see that if the ports get involved, we can have more of a say in what this looks like. You know, this infrastructure is going to sit on your port, it's going to sit on our port. We don't want a situation where we have, you know, 3 different plugs on every single berth, because each operator needs a different plug, and you don't want to have a different plug in Calais than you do in France, because Calais than you do in Dover, because everyone's investing more money than needs to be. So it's really, really helped us open the door to a really close engagement, and it's actually helped the ports, Dover and Calais, work really closely together on a number of things, which has been really beneficial. So it's definitely helped that relationship and has made everyone see that working together is the only way to get this done.
Well, I think that's right. And going back to your earlier point about grid capacity, I mean, this is a really big issue for the major ports across the UK as well. And I think that I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think there's a better understanding now in government and elsewhere about the importance of ports, but I think there's still a long way to go on that. And perhaps we can come on to that a bit later with Simon and Kirsty as well. Just in terms of the customer experience of those port users, and because of this really interesting time of where we are, given where we are on the transition, and it's neither big bang or retrofits, but it's a staged approach. How are you dealing with it culturally as an organization in terms of new demands on space, timelines, investment requirements? Talk to us about how these new demands, and I don't mean that in a negative way, are being considered by the team culturally.
I mean, it's been a really steep learning curve, hasn't it? It's a massive change for organisations, but it's been one that's been really well accepted actually at the port. We'd kind of been working on our own decarbonisation for a number of years quite quietly, and made some really big steps. I think we're 99% reduced on our scope 1 and 2 emissions as a port, for example. So it's not something that's like brand new to a lot of our staff, but I think the pace at which we're now working is something that everyone's keeping up to. But I think that ambition to like have such a huge impact on national supply chains, but also to be one of the first ports that might be able to offer, you know, a fully decarbonised route, is really pushing a lot of people. It's something that our chief exec and our whole executive team are so behind, that it's really been driven from the top that this is a priority for everyone across the port to work towards, which has been really great to see. And people are, I think, just so excited about the opportunities that arise here, that it's been a lot of change, and a lot of people are learning new things and seeing how they can help. But I think it's something that everyone's taken on board really, really well.
And that's permeating right the way through, really. That from electrification of tractors and forklifts and solar panels, all the way up to, you know, the big prize in terms of how we're going to be able to support the ferry companies.
Yeah, definitely. It's really great to see all of the guys on the ground even coming up with suggestions of things that they can do in their areas. So it's really lovely to see that we're really getting that engagement across all of our staff, that, you know, every little thing is going to help us as a whole. So it's been really great.
Megan, really interesting. Thank you so much for now. We'll come back as we bring this together at the back end of this session. But thank you for those really interesting perspectives from Dover, because I think it's a fascinating example where you've got some unique circumstances there as well. So thank you, Megan. I was very keen to also bring in Kirsty, who is our assistant engineer from the Connected Places Catapult. Now, for those enlightened on this call, Kirsty, we all know what a catapult is, but perhaps as you introduce yourself, perhaps you could explain the Catapult network and also the role of the Connected Places. And also, I know you've done a lot of really interesting work and analysis and reports into ports and maritime. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of a broad summary of the Catapult as well as your background, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Geraint. So hi, everyone. As stated, I'm a systems engineer at the Connected Places Catapult. You might have heard of one of the other Catapult networks in the UK. We're one of those, and that is 9 centres for innovation that are based across the UK, and we're all private, non-profit organisations. So by Connected Places Catapult, we are the UK's innovation accelerator for cities, transport and place leadership. And that's where within transport, maritime and ports are a key part of our work. And that's where I come in because I lead our work on future fuels. And also we've done a really exciting piece of work over the last few months on wind-assisted propulsion systems. So our focus is quite broad, but we've got a dedicated team on the maritime and port side, which I work alongside. So I'm really happy to be here today. And I think we can get going on my slides. Thanks, Maxine. Brilliant. So next slide, please. I thought before delving into some of the work that we're doing and supporting at the Catapult, it might be worthwhile just looking to the vision that we're trying to support. So as part of that maritime and ports focus, our aim is really to accelerate new innovative technologies, support SMEs, and connect these to industry such as the Port of Dover and academics as well, such as Simon. So what we're striving towards is a net zero future port ecosystem that will include elements such as renewable energy generation where space and funding allows, as was just alluded to there by Meg, energy management systems, potential storage systems, decarbonised port operations themselves. So again, looking at vehicles and assets within the port and looking to electrify or transition to alternative fuel propulsion systems where possible. This also encompasses shore power and enabling future fuel supply to vessels, which is such an interesting problem, I think, because it's not consistent across the UK in terms of what bunkering solutions are best suited for each region and will be necessary, because it just won't be possible to facilitate too many fuels in one port. So quite a fascinating problem, but one I think that we're getting well set up to address over the coming years. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the drivers, what is then driving the transition to future fuel use across UK ports, and what are some of our partners and industry voicing? Well, the first one, quite clear, the decarbonisation incentive. So not just reducing carbon emissions, but improving air quality across ports and port cities as well. Second one, on the policy and regulation side. So we've got those underpinning targets such as the IMO greenhouse gas strategy, but also more recent developments such as enabling vessels to comply with the UK emissions trading scheme. And I know that there's a call at the moment from the government on what the role for maritime should be in that space. The third one, which we often touch on, is the future skills requirements. So we don't want to just support the future workforce, but also looking at how we can support and evolve the current workforce to be able to develop these new capabilities, such as shore power or new cabling systems, refueling in its future state to support the net zero vision. But working together with academic institutions is really key so that we've got a constant stream of those skills flowing through into the workforce as well. And then the last one, energy and infrastructure resilience. So improving the direct control that we've got over energy supply and storage systems. And yes, I think upgrades to the grid are definitely vital to reach the levels of demand that we've got across ports. But where possible, local energy production it is needed where space allows as well. And we want to focus on improving resilience against market changes, so that we can protect the role that ports have as key nodes to the nation's trade ongoing. Next slide, please. So now I've just got 3 areas of our work that I wanted to highlight that's set out to support this vision and support future fuel adoption as well. So the first is our focus on maritime future fuels. So this is a piece of work that I lead on and was really motivated by some of the challenges on the left-hand side. So I've pulled out 4 here. That industry engagement, such as those on the call and wider partners that we've got in the UK have voiced. So the first one is robust energy and emission data collection, where a lot of UK ports find it difficult to have granular data collected on their energy and emissions that will inform priorities. So I think there's a lot of progress that's been made on the Scope 1 and Scope 2 side, but Scope 3 is a bit more difficult and more difficult in terms of where the responsibility lies as well. But the key thing for us to do is measure it so we can actually see the impact of the changes that we're making. The second one is around certainty of future fuel, the future fuel supply chain and availability by region. And this is why something that I'm really interested in is mapping the supply chain across the UK and matching that to off-takers. I think that's really important so that not only are we sending a signal to the supply chain, but off-takers are really confident that they're going to be able to use the fuels that they've set out to do. So with the new technologies that they're adopting. The third one, I wouldn't emphasize too much because I think it's been mentioned already on the energy infrastructure and storage side with the grid upgrades needed. And then the last is just future fuel costs and how this may vary over time. So that's looking to things like e-methanol and hydrogen, because at the moment we've got projections, but there will be uncertainty because we've not got yet a developed supply chain, as is the same across the world. So therefore, we've done a little bit of work over the past year to develop a future fuel blueprint, and it's not going to solve all of those problems, of course, but the idea is it's supposed to be a bit of a foundation for UK ports, harbours and vessel operators to have an idea of what others might be using and potential pathways to adoption. So that includes what access to funding they could explore, what other stakeholder groups might help, for example, with feasibility studies or with demonstrations of new technologies. So really looking to support those stakeholders achieve net zero in the next 5 or 10 years, setting up those foundational activities. Next slide, please. So another really exciting area that we've done some work on, I think last year, is an Irish Sea green shipping corridor. And this particular one is between Liverpool, the Port of Liverpool and Belfast Harbour as well. So we led a consortium to perform a concept study exploring how we'd provide clean energy to berth vessels and then also clean propulsion solutions as well. So we looked at what's the current status of operations, like what are the current emissions on the route and the current energy requirements, and what are potential pathways to adopt the corridor and enable the ecosystem to facilitate this. And looking to some of the preferences of the vessel operators and potential infrastructure at both ends, methanol and shore power in combination were seen as the preferred option for this corridor. And there's a few initial findings from the study and a lot of detail that you can find via the QR code as well. But the 3 findings I wanted to highlight today was that existing infrastructure is somewhat capable, but needs a lot of adaptation to facilitate the use of methanol. And I guess something that the Port of Liverpool and Belfast Harbour have a little bit more of is a bit more space than Dover, for example, to be able to lay some of those foundations. But what is consistent is the investment needed in the grid, and then also the fact that the new terminal infrastructure needs to be designed and delivered, because these aren't fuels that we've been used to supplying to vessels in these locations. And one learning I wanted to highlight is that there's no single solution that will solve the complexities. It is a very complex operation on the corridor and for the infrastructure needed at both sides. But a lot can be learned from innovations such as this because they're first movers. There are ways for us to demonstrate these new technologies, understand what works well. So I think the purpose of this is really to push progress and gather momentum within decarbonisation. Nothing will go completely perfect, but the idea is getting it as good as possible so that we can learn and translate those learnings to other locations as well. Next slide, please. So third and finally, this is my last slide, I wanted to mention our work with the Port of Aberdeen on the Zero Emission Vessels and Infrastructure programme. And this is one that Simon is also a key part of, so I'm sure he'll be able to add some more detail on that later if people are more interested. But just to set the scene a little bit, in Aberdeen, around 78% of all port emissions are derived from ships using marine fuels at berth. And the cost of this could be in the region of around £14 million per annum. And that was using the government's methodology for carbon value as of 2021. So the Shore Power in Operation demonstrator project that we are part of, alongside the consortium on the screen, is set out to supply clean electricity to vessels at 7 berths across the Port of Aberdeen. So cutting emissions at those berths by around 80% compared to the baseline case. I think one really key part of the programme that we're focused on is exploring the economic viability of this, because that has been a significant challenge in the past, and how we can understand how to promote the uptake to ports across the UK by learning from the Aberdeen case. So that's a little bit of a flavour in terms of 3 projects that I thought would be relevant to today, but it's important to note that at the Catapult, we're always looking at new opportunities for innovation, new projects that people are focused on. So really keen to follow up with anyone who's got ideas or proposals in this space as well.
Kirsty, thank you. Really interesting perspectives there. And on those, on your point regarding there's sort of not one answer to this, are you at the Connected Places Catapult? Are you looking internationally for good examples or interesting pilot projects and schemes that could be applicable to the UK?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are very much UK focused, but there's a lot that we can learn. I think the Netherlands is always going to be a significant area of innovation, especially looking at the Port of Rotterdam. So we can take learnings from there, but I would say it's not as common to have the significant space constraints that we have here in the UK at all of these other areas, because looking to Meg's example from the energy generation side, a lot of other ports have just gravitated towards wind generation and solar where possible. So I think that's an advantage that the Netherlands has over us in terms of significant wind generation potential. But I see that as a key opportunity on the corridor side, because we're already seeing, for example, the Port of Tyne setting up a corridor with the Netherlands. And that's something where if we can get 1 or 2 of these green shipping corridors in place and learning from them, it can only benefit us.
Really interesting. And I think the bit that's interesting as I look at some of this is ultimately we don't want to have 1, 2, 10 green shipping corridors. We want to have everyone having the ability to have that connection between the two ports, whichever the customer, whether the transaction is taking place. I think that's the overall bit, is that we've got to find a way to make sure there's an investment case here. And I think that, going back to Megan's point, is that certainly from the private sector ports, and of course we're in a slightly unique situation in the UK where we've got private ports, trust ports, and all the rest of it. But I do think there's a challenge for ports to think about some fuels that may be fashionable, that may come and go in 2 or 3 years, or maybe 5 years. But as we all know, in port terms, that's a day. It's nothing really. So I think this is part of the challenge. And then I suppose the other point then, who pays? Is it public money? Is it private money? All the rest of it. So perhaps you come back around on that. The other quick point which you touched on at the top of your remarks, Kirsty, is, and I'm interested in the work that the Catapult has done on this, is that if you think about certainly the larger ports in UK, including Dover, they are a massively important part of the local community as well, be it a city or a town or the local economic indicators. And for many parts of the UK and some challenging parts in the UK, our ports are the largest employers. And if they're not today, I think Future Fuels probably opens up the opportunity where we'll go on to be some of the largest employers in certain communities. So as you touched on the supply chains and mapping the supply chains, is a little bit of chicken and egg here, because it's quite difficult to map supply chains without a market being made for some of these fuels just yet. So I'm just interested in some of the how you see ports being linking into communities, and B, the mapping that follows, because it's a really big issue for us as we think about modal shift, roads, rail, power, some of the planning challenges we come up against. So there's a few points there, Kirsty, but I think it is relevant.
No, some really excellent points in there. I think the first one was around the next sort of 5-10 years being quite a transitional period in terms of fuels, and that being a bit of a blink of an eye. That's definitely more so the case on the vessel perspective. So we're seeing a big shift to dual fuel methanol vessels, for example, for those who can afford to make that transition now. But when you look at the carbon emissions still associated, unless it's all clean methanol, it doesn't seem to be the natural choice for 2040, 2050 to do so. So I think that's where there is a bit of a challenge. But I do think it'll be specific locations across the UK, for example, that'll sway towards methanol, and others might have to hold back and wait for a cleaner solution. And I think that's probably why on the port asset and port operations side, electrification is definitely the best way to go, unless we've got some solid hydrogen alternatives, for example. But it's something we just can't get around unless we want to kind of wait and hold off for too long. We need to have some transitional fuels.
Just quickly on that point, Kirsty, sorry to cut across you, just quickly on that point, I think there's a wider point as well, which I think is important in all of this, is the sort of resilience of our ports and the critical national infrastructure element here, about how we, as you quite rightly say, some ports may wait, some ports may not have the latest technology. That does change the dynamic potentially of the ability to be resilient and support future growth. Well, any thoughts on that? And Megan as well, perhaps, and Simon, if you want to add any thoughts on that particular before I come to you, Simon.
Yeah, I think this is where we need to be very strategic with the funding opportunities that we put in place to make sure that we're not creating an environment where some ports are left behind. And I think there's always a place for things like small scale demonstrations and workboat demonstrations. Fisheries have a major role. So I think we just need to think very carefully about where we're placing funding, because it shouldn't be the case that some ports are in a position where they can't afford to make a transition in any case. That I think is part of the responsibility of the government to do that foresighting. But I'd be interested in Simon or Meg's views if they've got any.
I think one of the things we've been thinking about, especially with regards to resilience as well, is that everything being reliant on electricity, for example, for our ferries, like is that not very resilient? Should we have a problem with our grid income or something like that? So when we've been thinking about local generation, which is a bit of a challenge for us because of space and protected areas, things like that, is that not helping us become more resilient though? So do we need to kind of look at this from a long-term resilient point of view as well? It's something that's really important to us. We currently have problems with our grid income going down all the time, and we at the minute we have backup generation to provide the entire amount of the electricity, and we used it a few weeks ago, for example. So resilience is something that's really important in this piece here, because we can't be in a position whereby we jeopardize that kind of supply chain for the UK. I mean, some of the concerns we have at the minute is the ferry operators, the future vessels are looking at, they'd have to charge at both ends to be able to make a full journey. They wouldn't be able to kind of charge at one end and then get all the way back. And are we causing a problem from a resilience point of view there? Because what if the charge is down at one end for maintenance? And so I think this piece is really important, and it's something that needs to be really considered when we talk about these future fuels, because we can't just put all of these ports in a position where they can't function and maintain the trade that we need in the UK just because it's the right thing to do from an environment perspective. It does have to be quite a balanced approach.
Yes, and I agree with that. Simon, perhaps you could come on to this. I'm slightly mindful of time. I want to keep the time, but Kirsty, really, really interesting remarks, and perhaps you can go back around to that as we start to wrap up. But I'm very, very keen to hear from Dr. Simon Bullock, who, as we said, is Research Associate at the University of Manchester. Good morning, Simon, and you're very welcome. And I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks very much, Geraint. So yeah, I'm work at the Tyndall Centre. It's a 5-university collaboration working on all aspects of climate change, and the Tyndall Manchester group focuses a lot on mitigation, and a little team here, we work on shipping maritime decarbonisation. So yeah, that's us. I've been at Tyndall for 5 years. Could you put the first slide up, please, Maxine? Thanks. So yeah, in my remarks, it's hard to make generalizations about the UK port sector because, as we all know, the UK ports are wildly different in size and function. So I'm just going to make 3 points about, based on my centre's research, which do apply to all UK ports, and how those ports react to these 3 things varies depending on their circumstances. And I'll say a little at the end about the role for government in supporting ports, because I think that's essential. So next slide, please. It's on climate. So the first point is that we do need some quick wins on climate change. And whether it's floods or wildfires, we're seeing major climate impacts already. It's imperative to try and limit global heating to 1.5 degrees, because above that is when the risk of passing irreversible climate tipping points really ramps up. So time is running out on that, and the climate science is very clear that it's reducing emissions fast this decade is by far the most important issue. So for maritime, the main point here is that although deploying new fuels like ammonia or methanol is important, this is only going to happen at scale in the 2030s. The port and ship infrastructure needed will take many years to scale up. And that means that in the maritime sector, given that it's this decade that it's important, we need to look beyond fuel and look at what's doable right now. And that means how do we use less fuel in the next few years? So next slide, please. So the second point is that at the moment, ports take very different approaches on climate in the UK. Some focus just on their own emissions, scope 1 and 2. Others, like Aberdeen, that Kirsty mentioned, they embrace scope 3 emissions. In our view, it's essential for ports to include scope 3 emissions in their strategies on climate, particularly from ships. Those are the overwhelming source of emissions in ports for almost every port. And even though ports obviously don't have full control over these, they do have quite a lot of leverage. So port strategy should certainly cover scope 3 and prioritize action with ship operators to cut ship emissions in ports. Next slide, please. Third point is about the alternatives to fuel oils. Although there's been a lot of research and trials and deployment of lower carbon fuels in recent years, and this is really important stuff, the challenges to marine fuel oils all have problems. And it does mean that it's still difficult to see which might be the winners. And I'm going to go through some parts of this table very quickly, based on a lot of my colleagues' work on life cycle analysis. So firstly, LNG, a lot of take-up of this recently, but it's not a serious option for climate change. It's high carbon, even if its major methane slip problem is addressed. Ammonia is seen as a leading contender, but it's got major concerns with safety. It's exceptionally toxic. It also has a potential problem with nitrous oxide emissions, which is a potent greenhouse gas in its own right. Methanol's been mentioned. Methanol's main issues are around scalability and cost. So methanol still produces carbon dioxide when it's burned. So for it to be a good low carbon fuel, its production method has to be carbon negative. And there are 2 ways to do that. First is e-methanol, making it via hydrogen and renewable electricity, but this also needs a source of carbon dioxide. And that direct air capture of carbon dioxide is likely to be very expensive and also difficult to scale. The second option is biomethanol, using bioenergy as a feedstock. The problems here are those similar to all of the biofuel options, ones of scalability and sustainability. So sustainable, genuinely net zero sources of bioenergy are in limited supply. There are major and increasing global demands on land for food for 9 billion people, for nature, and for all of the other sectors, not just maritime, which increasingly also want to use biofuels as well. So the conclusion for this, I think, is that for maritime, the working assumption should be that all of these alternative fuels problems could be resolved to some degree, but it's likely that they will be difficult and expensive to source at the necessary scale. And that means, again, that the sector should prioritize using less fuel. And for ships, this means route optimization, use of wind assist, energy efficiency devices, and this is where ports come in. It means using electricity wherever possible, when at berth for certain, but also in batteries and ships. And that's more relevant for countries like the UK, where our predominance of using short sea shipping makes hybrid and fully electric vessels more viable than in other countries. So to draw those three ports together for UK ports, I'd argue that the most critical aspect of port climate change strategies is to focus on electrification, and particularly for infrastructure support for ships. Support provision of shore power is essential. So just a little bit on shore power. Next slide, please. It's not just a good climate change solution, it's great for local air pollution, which is one of the reasons that the Port of Aberdeen went for shore power, because the port is right in the city centre. The other great thing about shore power is it's deployable right now. We don't have to wait. However, there are major barriers to UK shore power. Next slide, please. Just going to mention two of these. The first one is that shore power struggles to compete with ships just using electricity made from burning fuel oil on board the vessel. And the reason for this cost problem is that shore power is very highly taxed in the UK and marine fuel is not, which I'll show on the next graph on the next slide. Sorry, it's a bit complicated, but 5 years ago, if shore power wasn't taxed, then it would be about the same price as ship fuel or oil electricity. But that situation has got a lot worse in the last 5 years because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the spike in gas prices, which has fed into electricity prices. So now we have a situation where in the UK, shore power is a lot more expensive than just using fuel oil. And that isn't the case in the European Union, because the European Union have a suite of policies that are working on shore power economics. So the UK government is supportive of shore power, but its tax policies are actively blocking shore power's uptake. And this is the situation, in our view, it really needs to address through a revised Clean Maritime Plan. The next slide, going back to the barriers on shore power, as both Megan and Kirsty have mentioned, grid capacity is one of the biggest other barriers beyond cost. So ports often struggle to get the extra power requirements from the grid. As has been said, it's both time consuming and expensive. So there is a job for UK ports to work with the government and Ofgem and the National Grid and the DNOs to set out clearly how much power UK ports need and put in place a delivery plan for how it can be supplied. It's a national issue, not just for any one port. And I think that recent new projects like Sea Change from SSEN are positive signs that industry players are working together more on this. But again, these initiatives really do need some overarching support and direction from the government in a refreshed, clean maritime plan. So coming to the end, the next slide. This is a list of, on the left, 6 things that are needed to accelerate UK shore power deployment, and on the right, how things have moved in the last 5 years. And I think the government has done some really positive things, funding projects through CMDC and ZEVI. But for those projects to accelerate, there has to be some policy support. So it's really essential that the Clean Maritime Plan refresh, whatever it's called, comes in place as soon as possible. So just to summarize, last slide. UK ports, like all sectors of the economy, need to take urgent action on climate change. And the priority focus for UK ports with that should be electrification and to work with shipping operators to deliver shore power. But for this to be successful, it's not just something that ports can do alone, or even with the shipping operators. They need the support of the electricity sector and specific policy support from the government. And actually, on my very final slide is just some links to some of the research that we've done here. I'm sure the slides will be circulated, but all the detail behind the points that I've raised today are in those 4 links. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak.
Simon, thank you very much. Some really, really interesting perspectives there. And I think that your point earlier about sort of some of the immediate challenges and long-term challenges around climate change, this slightly takes us back into the sort of resilience point, because for our ports to be resilient going forward, we need to make sure that we've sort of adapted for any potential impact around climate. And one of the topics which I think is interesting, maybe you have a view on, is water levels. What are we seeing on water levels rising, potential rising water levels in the UK? Is there any evidence of that yet?
So I'm not an expert on the climate science, but my understanding is that's going to be a long-term problem. The sea levels will rise. A lot of climate change is baked in and we can't avoid it. So there will be extra adaptation costs from that. I think that the thing that we're starting to see more often is more extreme events. So not more frequent storms, but more severe storms when they happen, higher winds, the ability of the atmosphere to hold more moisture because of climate change means that we will get more and more severe rain events, storm events. So yeah, unfortunately, that is a cost that ports and coastal communities will bear the brunt of. So yeah, all the more imperative to reduce these additional costs as much as possible.
Thank you, Simon. The other piece which I think was interesting in your remarks is in the relations with the EU, and I know that the EU Commission is working on a new port strategy in 2025. And again, I think there's challenging opportunities there, but I also think there's a very clear focus from the Commission about competitiveness of ports, and I think there's a fundamental rub here, which is no bad thing, but the ambition of a new government coming in and going for growth, but also potentially reducing the impact of some of this economic activity through fuels, as you quite rightly suggest, Simon. How do you see that playing out in terms of on the EU side and potentially in the UK?
Yeah, well, there's a huge question. I think one of the good things that the new government is doing is it's starting to put forward proposals that will integrate the UK policy regime better with the EU policy regime. And just as one example of that is bringing maritime into the UK emissions trading scheme. And the proposals that are come out, the consultation's still live, I think, until the end of next week, are suggesting a much stronger alignment with the EU ETS, which is better for ports and shipping operators, particularly for shipping operators. It reduces bureaucracy. If it's instead of having two similar, it still has two schemes to deal with, but they are going to be much more similar with similar reporting requirements. So the bureaucracy will be reduced, and the chances of there being gaming going on because you've got different costs from different trading schemes will be reduced if they do align those two schemes properly.
Which slightly addresses one of the questions we've had in the chat about the sort of difference in the regulatory regimes and all the rest of it. But I also think that it's going to be quite interesting in this next 12, 18 months where a UK government launches a new industrial strategy, which I think should focus on hard infrastructure such as ports and airports and road and rail, all this sort of stuff. And again, with the balance then of thinking about climate adaptation and the environmental impacts of such activity. And then also, as the Commission has quite rightly said, there's a competitiveness element they're thinking about very carefully in Europe. And I think that there's certainly from the private sector ports, competitiveness drives investments, and in a dynamic market environment in the UK, which we have, ports are competing for investment, also trying to make those right decisions going forward. So I think there's a quite interesting dynamic right now, Simon.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's important that the government doesn't ignore the port sector. In the two examples, in its work on electric vehicles, it's pumped billions and billions of pounds into infrastructure for charging for the road sector. It hasn't done so for maritime, and that's an omission from the previous government, I think. And this government should really put as much effort and capital support into port electrification as it has done for the roads network. And similarly on tax exemptions for high electricity costs. So the previous government did a very good thing with its supercharger policy. It removed a lot of the electricity taxes from sectors like steel and chemicals, which have competitiveness problems. So the government was right to do that, but what it didn't do was a similar thing for the port sector. So ships in the UK should get exemptions from the shore power electricity taxes they currently have to pay, as indeed every single European country, EU country pretty much does do so for shore power. So yeah, hopefully the government, through a new clean maritime plan, will start to address those anomalies.
Simon, thank you. Really interesting perspectives. And as we start to bring this together, what I'm sensing is that I think there's a clarity about what's needed, what needs to be done. And I think there's some broader challenge about how we do that and how we phase these things and who pays. But I think there is a clarity there. But I think there is an optimism. Would you share that optimism, Megan, Kirsty, and Simon, in terms of what comes next in the UK port sector?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first on that one. I think that ports are such an excellent test bed for a lot of these innovations. So I think Meg mentioned HGVs earlier. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about vessels, about port communities. What better place to test some of these innovations and to push decarbonisation than somewhere where you can have multimodal transport and various different fuels across the UK. So I think, if anything, what's been happening in ports isn't broadcast enough in terms of driving innovation, lots of opportunities for UK businesses. So that's what I would like to see, and we're definitely pushing for that.
Any brief thoughts, Megan?
I agree completely with Kirsty. I think the port sector has done a lot of great stuff even previously, before this has become such a big thing that we're not always the best at talking about and promoting. And I think, yeah, we're as Kirsty said, a brilliant position to have an effect on supply chains as well as a whole, to impact other industries that aren't just the ports themselves. So I think definitely there's a lot of optimism.
Simon?
I really like the energy in the port sector. I've only been working in this area for 5 years, but when I started, you were far more engaged with climate change and the innovation that's required, and I've only seen that increase in the last 5 years. I go to the conferences, and the energy and drive from people right across the sector to get things done is just really refreshing and admirable compared with some other sectors I won't mention.
Well, and I think it's, and I've been struck by this as I visit my ports around the country, is that, you know, some of the amazing schemes have been put in place to support the local environment and support nature. And you sort of ask the question, when was that done? And I hear, but 1993. It's amazing some of the stuff that was done many, many years ago, and then it continues to follow that since. And I think that, the government can do a lot to support this, what can be a really, really fast growth sector in terms of planning and modal shift, as we discussed, and sort of power and sort of regulatory drag. And that's not about getting rid of regulations, but just making sure we've got the most efficient way of going about our business. And I say this to many people: if you care about growth, you should really care about ports. And then if we get the growth, we can then invest in other parts of the businesses to make sure we're as sustainable as possible. So in terms of bringing it together, can I thank Megan, can I thank Kirsty, and can I thank Simon for some really interesting remarks. And I think Maxine and the team will put this up online, and we will share the various decks. But I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us this morning, not least the panelists, but for those who dialed in and joined us this morning. So thank you very much. And at 11 a.m, I'll say thank you very much and bye-bye.